Hey there, it's Joe the Disney Guy, and welcome to the very first Disney Guy review. We have a lot to get to today, so let's not waste any time. We're looking at the one that started it all, and still the fairest one of all, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In 1916, all of the newsboys in Kansas City were invited to a special showing of a silent movie. That movie was Snow White, starring Marguerite Clark, and one of the newsboys in attendance that day was a young Walt Disney. That silent film would stay with Walt throughout the years as he steadily grew into one of the world's leaders in animation. In 1933, Disney released an animated short, The Three Little Pigs, which was a smash hit with an audience stuck in the Great Depression who all had a big bad wolf knocking at their door. Walt was happy with how the three pigs, despite being similar characters, all had distinct and different personalities. He even said that the Three Little Pigs would have made the studio huge money were it not a short subject cartoon. It was then that Walt decided that short films were great to keep the company going, but the only way the company was ever really going to make money was in feature films. Walt started to look at fairy tales to try and decide what story would make for the best movie, when he settled on the story that captivated him nearly 20 years earlier, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Walt thought it was the perfect story. It had a dark and evil villain, it had a romantic love story, and it even had sympathetic and potentially comedic characters. One night in 1934, Walt brought his crew together and told them of his vision, acting out all the parts of the characters and even saying where songs would go. Walt's bravado and confidence convinced his crew, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was announced as Disney's first feature-length film. Upon this announcement, people in the film industry laughed at the idea, dubbing it Disney's folly. They said that watching bright colors for that long would hurt people's eyes, that no one could emotionally connect to a drawn character, and that no one would sit through a feature-length cartoon. Even Walt's own brother and wife tried to talk him out of the idea. So how did Walt respond? He mortgaged his house and put his entire fortune on the production. That's right, the man's own family told him not to try this crazy idea, so he literally decided to bet the house on it. Now I don't know if Walt was just outrageously crazy or outrageously confident, but you gotta give the guy credit. He certainly didn't go halfway on this idea. Regardless of how outwardly confident Disney was, there was still plenty of concerns over whether or not his critics were right. What if people really couldn't sit through a feature-length cartoon? That was, however, until a visit to France in 1935. Walt, his brother Roy, and their wives traveled overseas for Walt to receive a special award from the League of Nations when they saw a theater showing a bunch of Disney shorts in a row. Walt figured that if people would sit through 5 or 6 shorts in a row, why wouldn't they sit through a feature film? In order to prepare his animators, Disney essentially turned his Silly Symphony series into a training ground. Shorts like The Goddess of Spring helped teach the animators how to draw a more realistic-looking human woman, and shorts like The Old Mill were essentially large-scale tests for their multiplane camera, a new device used by the Disney animators to help add dimension and distance to the animation. When the planning of Snow White first began, the story and characters were much more comical than the final product would end up being. For example, the Evil Queen was originally a much more pompous, ugly, cartoony character, and the prince was more goofy and clownish than in his final incarnation. In fact, Disney story writers were offered $5 for every gag that they pitched that Walt liked. However, Walt began to fear that this sort of cartoony style would prevent audiences from really connecting with the characters, so the tone shifted to a more realistic take on the fairy tale. This fear of believability and audience caring for the character was something that concerned Walt greatly, particularly with the scene of the huntsman attempting to kill Snow White. This scene in particular took months to properly animate in a way that would cause an audience to truly be concerned that the huntsman, a drawing essentially, was going to kill Snow White, another drawing. This lingering fear of an audience believing a cartoon to be a real-life character was finally alleviated when the crew was discussing a fall during the forest scene and an animator asked, "Wouldn't Snow White get hurt?" showing genuine concern for Snow White's well-being. The creation of the Dwarfs was another long process. Dozens of names were thrown out for the Dwarfs, including Awful, Weepy, Dirty, Cranky, Hungry, Lazy, Soulful, Helpful, Tearful, Shifty, Tipsy, Queasy, Surly, Goofy, and Mickey. Alright, I made up those last few, but you get the idea. There are a lot of names considered. Finally, Walt narrowed the list down to the 7 we know today. Take it away, Walt.
This pompous-looking individual is Doc, the self-appointed leader of the group. And this little fellow is Bashful. He's secretly in love with Snow White. And this funny face is Sneezy. He has hay fever. And old Droopy Eyes is called Sleepy. And Happy here with the beaming smile. And old Sourpuss here is Grumpy, the woman hater. And last but not least is Dopey.
Walt also knew that sound would be vitally important to the film's success. Composers Paul J. Smith and Lee Harline worked directly with the writers to ensure that the music and dialogue were perfectly in sync before animation even began. Walt insisted that the songs in the film be directly integrated within the story, so as not to seem like they stopped the action or came out of nowhere. The search for the perfect voices to play the characters had also begun, most importantly, of course, for Snow White. Those auditioning would be brought into a sound booth and told to sing and read lines. Unbeknownst to them, Walt Disney would be listening from his office and making his decisions there. Because the audience would only hear the voice and not actually see the actress, Walt did not want to be influenced by sight, so he made a point to never see those who were auditioning for the role. After over 150 girls tried out, 20-year-old Adriana Caselotti auditioned and was immediately given the role by Walt Disney. The only character harder to cast than Snow White was Dopey, so Walt just decided to make him a mute. If only all things were that simple. Don't like somebody's voice? Great, you're not allowed to talk now. But of course, the bread and butter of any Disney production is animation, and Snow White had to be bigger and better than anything the Disney Studios had done yet. Walt decided that he wanted Snow White to have a European storybook-like feel, and to do that he went to some of the leading European illustrators, such as Albert Herder and Gustav Tenggren. Herder in particular was in charge of the design of the film, and nothing, not even rocks in the background, went in unless first being approved by him. In order to help make the animations look as realistic as possible, Disney animators used a technique known as rotoscoping to study how to draw human motion. Walt brought in various live models and actors to give the animators something to base their drawings off of. They even dressed up a man named Don Brody as the evil witch. I don't know about you, but that guy terrifies me. In order to color the film, 1,500 different shades of color were used, including actual rouge for Snow White's cheeks. Walt was also known as a ruthless editor and made cuts of Snow White even up to the last minute if he felt that a scene didn't directly move the plot along or develop character. Most of the scenes that were lost were scenes involving the Dwarfs, including a deleted song called Music in Your Soup, and a scene involving Doc and Grumpy getting in a fight over whether or not Snow White can stay. Walt wanted to make sure that the focus stayed on Snow White's story, which is why so many little scenes with the dwarves were left on the cutting room floor. Of course, all of these things cost money. The initial budget for the film was $250,000, but that was quickly up to $500,000. By the summer of 1937, the production had cost $1 million and counting, but the studio was out of money, meaning Walt needed to convince the bank to loan them more money or Snow White could not be finished. The bank insisted on seeing what Walt had before approving another loan, so Walt and Joe Rosenberg, the loan officer for the bank involving Hollywood Productions, sat together and watched the unfinished version of Snow White. After not speaking throughout the showing, Rosenberg finally declared to Walt before he left, "This picture will make a hatful of money," and approved the loan. Before it was all said and done, Snow White cost nearly $1.5 million to make, an astronomical amount of money for a movie in those days. Through it all, though, on December 21st, 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs opened to a star-studded Hollywood premiere. Walt Disney was tickled by the fact that all of Hollywood came out for a cartoon. By the way, look at this footage of Walt showing up at the premiere, and you tell me he doesn't look like the coolest man in the universe. Look at him, that scarf, that jacket, even the little head nod. So cool. And when it was all said and done, despite all of the uncertainty, all of the doubters, all of the naysayers, and all of the money spent, Snow White received a standing ovation as the film ended. So it goes without saying that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is one of the most influential animated films ever made. But is it a good movie? Well, yeah, actually, but I do have some minor complaints. The entire movie moves at a brisk pace, which is good and is what Walt wanted, but I feel like the beginning of the movie moves almost too fast. Within 10 minutes, we've met all the characters, set up the love story, set up the main problem, dodged the murder attempt, and Snow White is already in the woods. It just feels a touch too fast, and I feel like we don't know all that much about the characters before the meat of the story starts. I mean, look at the prince. We see him for all of about 2 minutes, and he doesn't even have a name. Not even generic Prince Charming, just the prince. Why do the dwarves mine for diamonds? And to be honest, what do we even know about Snow White, other than that she's beautiful, kind, and loves animals? Though, I mean, just look at those things. They're like the epitome of cuteness. Who wouldn't love all wild animals if they look like that? But, to be fair, there is an explanation for most of my complaints. Obviously, financial restraints meant that the movie had to be shorter than most, and the bulk of the time had to be spent on the adventure, not the intro. And as for the prince, he actually did have a bigger role in the original storyboards. He was supposed to get captured by the Queen and race to save Snow White and all of that stuff, but because animating a human man was a real challenge for the animators at the time, the role of the prince was downsized dramatically to the absolute bare minimum. Though I still stand by they should have given him a name. I mean, come on, how hard could it be to give a guy a name? Why not John or something? There you go, he's Prince John now. Anyway, like I said, those complaints are really minor and really get outweighed by all the positives in the movie. I love the little note from Walt Disney that starts the film. It's just one of those small gestures that let you know how grateful Walt was for his crew. Also, who doesn't love the vintage storybook opening at the beginning of a Disney movie? Which actually leads me to a choice I thought was very interesting. I'd always found it odd that instead of a narrator, there's actual writing on the screen setting the scene, both in the beginning and in the end of the film. But the more I thought about it, the more it makes sense. The whole style of Snow White is that of a storybook, and the writing gives it more of that feel. I also found it interesting to think of how this movie would be different were it not made in the 30s, aside from the obvious animation enhancements. For example, after Snow White bites the apple, we don't actually see her going into the sleeping death. I feel like these days, filmmakers would be all over that visual. Also, was trespassing more commonly accepted in the 1930s? The prince just hops the wall into someone else's castle to meet Snow White, and Snow White sees that nobody's home in the little cottage but decides, they won't mind if I just take a nap in their bed. All I'm saying is, these days, if I took a nap in someone else's bed without asking them permission first, I'd need a lot more than a cute face and a catchy song to get out of that one. Speaking of songs, as I said before, Walt wanted the music to be totally integrated within the movie, and I thought that was done masterfully. The score not only sets the mood, but also highlights the motions of the various characters. I think the scene that best shows what I'm talking about is this one where the dwarves are walking outside to wash up. And as for the songs, well, I mean, they're classics. How can you not love Someday My Prince Will Come and Hi Ho? By the way, a little note on Hi Ho. Real quick, sing the chorus to yourself right now. Go on, do it, I'll wait. Alright, you done? Good. Now let's listen to the version as it is in the movie.
Hi ho, it's home from work we go.
Now I bet you all sang it's off to work we go. But as you just saw in the movie, the actual line is, it's home from work we go. Somehow over the years, that line has been changed. Even Disney themselves changes it from time to time, so what gives? Lyric confusion aside, my last point on this movie is that the animation is really fantastic. I can't even imagine going to see this movie in 1937, where my ideas of what a movie was had always been this, and then to see this. It must have been mind-blowing. And just look at some of these outdoor scenes and the realistic usage of lights and shadows. Heck, this was a time when it was hard to draw a human, and yet this transformation scene is stunning. The Disney studio put years into this effort, and it clearly shows, and I think that's why Snow White holds up so well, even today. The movie really doesn't feel like it's 76 years old, which truly makes it, as Disney always likes to say, timeless. To say that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs has left a huge legacy would be a vast understatement. First and foremost, Snow White was the first ever animated film, and who knows what the fate of animation would have been were it not successful. Snow White was also the first film to have merchandise available the day of release, was the first film to reanimate scenes in 20 different languages for international release, it influenced women's fashion, and it was also the first film soundtrack ever released on phonograph record. All things that are commonplace from today's films. Well, I mean, except for the women's fashion thing. Who knew that 1930s women wanted to dress like dwarves? Snow White has also influenced movies outside of the animation genre, for example, Citizen Kane and The Wizard of Oz. Snow White is still considered one of the most successful films of all time. It made $8 million in its initial release and has been re-released by Disney 7 times, in 1944, 1952, 1958, 1967, 1983, 1987, and 1993. In all, Snow White has made a lifetime gross of $418 million, which is 10th all-time when adjusted for inflation. Though, as Walt Disney liked to point out, many theaters in the 30s boycotted showing Snow White because they felt it was too expensive to run a feature-length cartoon, and Snow White was a children's film at a time when a child's ticket was only 20 cents, which makes its grossing numbers even more impressive. And for its contribution to the genre of animation and film as a whole, Snow White was awarded an Academy Honorary Award in 1939, was added to the National Film Registry in 1989, and recognized by the American Film Institute as being the 34th best movie of all time, having the 19th best song of all time with Someday My Prince Will Come, having the 10th best villain of all time, and being the greatest animated film of all time. In the end, Disney's folly ended up being his greatest triumph. Well guys, that about wraps it up for me this week. Thank you all so much for watching, really, it means a lot to me. If you have any comments or suggestions about the show, leave them down below. I'd love to hear what you guys think. And if you liked what you saw and you want to learn more about the channel and the show, click right here for last week's video. If you're from the future, you can click right here for next week's video, and right down here for the next Disney Guy review. So again, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys all next week.